Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. Will Donald Trump fire Jerome Powell? Is the Federal Reserve about to get a well-deserved leash? Last week, Donald Trump posted on Truth how the Europeans just cut rates for the seventh time, yet Jerome Powell sits on his hands, even with crashing inflation. Last week, I mentioned we're actually in deflation right now. Trump added he can't wait for Powell's, quote, termination and might force him out early. In fact, the Fed's behavior is odd. For the past 112 years, the Fed has bailed out every policy-induced stock market crash, pumping out trillions of stock market morphine, the famous punch bowl, for everything from the Vietnam War to the 2008 bank crisis to COVID, where the Fed pumped $6 trillion to bribe voters into lockdowns. So with rising recession odds and a tariff-induced crash in stocks, where is Jerome Powell? Now, legally, the Fed has a dual mandate: price stability and economic growth. The economic growth part is how they justify policy bailouts. Those bailouts, of course, drive inflation, so much for price stability. Jim Grant has a great quote summing this up: the Fed's dual mandate is arsonist and firefighter. Now, you could argue the Fed should not bail out markets or the government, but the fact is the Fed is breaking 112 years of precedent. So there's three ways Trump can fight Powell. The easiest and weakest is appoint a shadow Fed chair to second-guess Powell until Powell's term ends in a year. The shadow would not have power, but he'll influence financial markets by signaling what policy will be in a year. The second option is wait and see on an upcoming Supreme Court case revisiting whether the president, and therefore voters, control so-called independent agencies, including the SEC, Equal Opportunity Commission, or the Federal Reserve. If he controls them, he can fire them all. But what if Trump wants to get rid of Jerome earlier, or doesn't want to gamble on the court? After all, a year is a long time when a paper recession looms from government layoffs and mass deportations, while a real recession looms from tariffs. Last week, Trump's chief economist Kevin Hassett said they're, quote, studying ways to get rid of Jerome. The most straightforward is that Trump can fire Fed members for cause, but interestingly enough, cause is not legally defined. Does it mean 4 years of double-digit inflation, or does Jerome Powell have to get caught with a hooker and a crack pipe? So as next, whether Trump gets rid of Powell now or waits a year, the overwhelming favorite on prediction market Kalshi is Kevin Warsh. Warsh is actually considered an inflation hawk, so he wants tight money and high rates to keep inflation low. But Warsh has also been loyal to Trump, so he'd probably cut rates to cushion federal layoffs, mass deportations, and tariffs. The larger question is whether the Fed should be independent of voters, like some occupying army. For a century, the Fed argued it needs independence to keep inflation low, citing academic research by professors who are paid by the Fed. Happily, there's an easy way to make the Fed very independent with actual growth and price stability. Just back the dollar with gold or Bitcoin. Last time this was visited was the Reagan administration. It was gold, not Bitcoin. It's time we have that talk again. Gold is on fire. How high can the yellow metal get? Since Trump won, gold has been on a tear, jumping by nearly a third. It's even more dramatic since the tariff wars, which gold tacking on 6% in 2 weeks, while stocks lost 7%. That's a nice change after gold went nowhere for 4 long years since its big jump in early COVID. Interestingly, while tariffs and de-dollarization are driving gold now, the rally in gold actually started more than a year ago, February of 2024. So it wasn't Trump, who back then had just announced his candidacy amid questions whether they would lawfare him out of the race. Bookies had Trump at just 25% odds back then. So what is driving the rally? Easy, the same thing that drove gold and Bitcoin in COVID, the avalanche of sovereign debt, and the future inflation it implies. Now, during COVID, public debt grew by $13 trillion in America alone. It's over $100,000 per American family. Europe, Japan, and China joined in the money printing orgy. This matters because in the near term, gold is influenced by micro factors, so Fed rates, GDP growth, tariff sanctions, wars. But the long game for gold or Bitcoin is a bet that paper money crashes and we remonetize on a gold standard. We're already seeing central banks rearranging the deck chairs. Last year I mentioned a senior Dutch central banker who admitted they are buying gold as, quote, insurance. Last week, numbers came out that central banks bought a net 24 tons of gold in a single month, making it 15 straight years that central banks are buying gold. Now, 15 years is interesting because that is the 2008 crisis, the near death of the global financial system that apparently spooked central banks enough to take them from decades of pawning off national gold reserves to buying gold hand over fist. In total, 7,000 metric tons of gold bought by central banks. So how long can it go? The key question is whether soaring national debts are sustainable or if we are headed for a money crisis. In Europe, more countries are crossing the magic line of 100% of GDP in debt, including relatively sober France. Germany just gutted their long-standing fiscal straitjacket dating from the Weimar hyperinflation. Given Europe's slow growth, spending will keep growing faster than the economy. Canada and Australia are in similar situations and very exposed to a China slowdown given their resource exports. Japan is even worse at nearly 300% of GDP in government debt, with over a quarter of the government budget eaten up by debt service. That goes to half when Japan normalizes interest rates. China is also at 300% of GDP, including massive local government debt spent to fake GDP, ghost cities, and bridges to nowhere. Finally, America, where efforts to cut spending and red tape are running up against the wall of Congress, which has done nothing on growth while apparently trying to re-spend DOGE savings. In other words, debt as far as the eye can see, and it is worldwide. Into all this, Trump threw a tariff grenade, which could spark recessions around the world. Recessions raise government debt because taxes slump and welfare soars. So let's explain. Near-term, gold is going to move with tariffs, recessions, and de-dollarization. Long-term, gold is a question of national debts. If governments get it under control, gold might drop by half going by pre-COVID. If, more likely, debt keeps getting worse, gold could easily hit 7,000 in the coming years. A word from our lead sponsor. The loudest voices in crypto, finance, and economics do not understand money. Join Parker Lewis and Drew Bonsall of Unchained for Bitcoin Not Crypto, a 3-part masterclass that lays out why 21 million is the key breakthrough and how Bitcoin, not blockchains, creates decentralization and why everything else will be built on Bitcoin. Understand why Bitcoin works and why nothing else does. Register free at unchained.com/Peter to learn more. If you own gold or silver, you know they're a great hedge against financial instability and let you grow your wealth outside the banking system and gain greater control over your finances. Monetary Metals offers you the ability to increase your precious metal ounces every single month. Instead of paying to own metal, with Monetary Metals, you get paid 4% on your gold paid in more ounces. Now's the time to secure your wealth and build your legacy in an asset that the government cannot inflate away. Join thousands of investors earning interest in physical gold and silver every month with Monetary Metals. Visit monetarymetals.com/Peter to learn more. Now back to our show. China is panicking over tariffs, moving heaven and earth and hundreds of billions of dollars to hide its worst economic crisis since COVID. Is China on the edge of collapse, or will they come to the table? After Trump imposed 145% tariffs on most Chinese goods, last week Beijing commanded its 867,000 state-owned enterprises, which make up a third of China's economy and most of its stock market, to buy their own shares to desperately prop up Chinese stock markets. It told private brokerages to monitor customers for, quote, excessive selling, presumably tied to your social credit score, since China is a police state. Meanwhile, commanded Chinese banks to buy yuan and dump dollars to prevent the Chinese currency from collapsing. The People's Bank of China, their Federal Reserve, jumped in, selling billions of U.S. treasuries not to crash our bond market, but to save the yuan. Beijing then cranked up the printing presses, promising the biggest fiscal deficit since 2010, the 2008 crisis aftermath, including dumping $178 billion of so-called special treasury bonds aimed at infrastructure, so bridges to nowhere to soak up unemployed workers, along with direct payments to companies hit by tariffs. Now, I mentioned in recent videos how last tariff war in 2018, China paid for the tariffs so its companies could maintain market share, which made the 2018 tariffs on China pretty much a free lunch. Note, all of this is on top of a $1.4 trillion stimulus package that China rolled out just after Trump's election. So the background here is China was not doing so hot before Trump's tariffs. Trillions in cheap money drove over production. At one point, China had 400 electric vehicle makers, of which 300 have already failed, about 100 to go. Copy and paste across hundreds of industries, and China has to dump cheap goods overseas. Overcapacity put China into deflation, but China's export prices crashed by 20% in some goods. This was already causing tensions with Europe, who opened anti-dumping probes on China before Trump showed up. Toss in the collapse in Chinese property markets, also bloated by cheap money, and a crash in foreign investment was negative $168 billion in 2024, and more than half of the Chinese economy was already in recession before Trump. So what's next? There's an entire industry of pundits predicting that China's on the verge of collapse, that it is a giant house of cards. In the long run, I don't think that's true. In many ways, China is much stronger than the U.S., certainly in manufacturing, which we stupidly gave away. The Chinese education system and small business environment offer valuable lessons for our useless politicians and bureaucrats. Having said at the moment, China is a lot more vulnerable than it looks. China's companies are swimming in debt. Their banks are over-leveraged, gambling big with a small pot, and exports to the U.S. make up a big enough share of China's economy to crash both. If that happens, Beijing may be forced to liquidate its overseas holdings, which are overwhelmingly parked in dollar assets, in order to fund the mother of bailouts. In a recent video, I mentioned how the dollar is falling and U.S. stocks are falling, partly because foreigners are liquidating. If China jumps in with both feet, we could see even bigger drops in the dollar and stock markets, extending to the bond markets that prop up our entire financial system. DOGE is going after university funding. The left is big mad, but it does raise the question, why do taxpayers give these gold-plated left-wing motherships $250 billion per year? The latest salvo comes at the once prestigious Harvard, who put itself in the hot seat by discriminating against Asian and white applicants, which is illegal under the Civil Rights Act, while egging on demonstrators threatening Jewish students. Trump told Harvard to cut it out, also demanding an end to racist DEI programs and allowing viewpoint diversity. Harvard dug in, citing, quote, independence, at which point the federal government said it would freeze over $2 billion in grant money to Harvard, with Trump musing that perhaps Harvard should lose its tax-exempt status. The left took that last one like a nuclear bomb, the end of democracy, but it's worth noting that Bob Jones University did lose its tax-exempt status for 40 years precisely for racism. The wider question is why taxpayers are funding Harvard, which sits on an endowment of $53 billion, enough that the running joke is Harvard is a hedge fund with a school attached. Throw on other universities, and they're sitting on more than $900 billion between them. And yet they sponge hundreds of billions from taxpayers every year, so much for independent. The reason they get the money, of course, is that universities have been loyal foot soldiers for the left-wing deep state. According to surveys, going to university swings political beliefs to the left by roughly 14 points. For whites, it's closer to 24 points. Meanwhile, universities fund left-wing causes and produce left-wing research used as propaganda for those causes on a level that would make U.S. aid blush, making universities the mother of political slush funds, but also the left-wing mothership that installs suitably brainwashed left-wingers into the commanding heights of every profession, from law to medicine to corporate management. Looking at you, Disney. Why do they get away with it? Easy. Universities capture the power to decide who gets a good job, forcing you to either send your kids to college for a couple $100,000 and a potential gender swap, or your kids will fix cars. This happened in a series of court cases culminating in a 1971 decision that effectively outlawed competency exams as racist because some races scored better. Universities milked the breach for, at this point, $5 trillion in federal funding and counting. Even today, most majors don't add any value. My former professor Brian Kaplan argued that most majors admission is the value, the following 4 years are completely useless, basically one long party. An expensive party, you could drink beer on a Thai beach at 1/10 the cost. So what's next? What happens if the federal government stopped funding universities from grants to subsidized student loans? For one, university would be a lot cheaper since government subsidies drive up tuition. More important, college would be a lot smaller. People would only go if their career needs it, so medicine, engineering, hard science, and banks would only lend for a college degree on useful careers, because without taxpayer bailouts, gender studies are pure credit risk. Before government, universities did engage in bona fide research funded by actual companies building actual products, instead of paying professors to gender swap rats or write about the feminist interpretation of glaciers, not a joke. The left will fight for every university penny because they know who butters their propaganda mill, and the country would be better cutting off all universities altogether. A word from our sponsor. One of the best ways to secure your Bitcoin is with a hardware wallet, a physical device that lets you keep your coins offline without internet connection. One of the most trusted names in hardware wallets is CoinKite, maker of the famous block clock. CoinKite devices are made in Canada and they're run by passionate Bitcoiners who've been at this since 2012, back when Bitcoiners were trading in person at swap meets. You can pick up hardware wallets and plenty of other goodies at coinkite.com/ProfSaintAnge. That's CoinKite.com/ProfSaintAnge. In crypto, we read about new hacks every week with top coins spiraling into oblivion. Except for Bitcoin. It has never been hacked. The enormous innovations going into crypto will ultimately migrate to the gold standard of Bitcoin. Trammell Venture Partners is a Bitcoin native venture capital firm that's been around since the beginning back in 2009. They back some of the top brands in the industry, including Kraken and Unchained. Check out the third annual report on Bitcoin native startups, tracking nearly 1.2 billion in early-stage Bitcoin native software startups. Visit tvp.fund. Now back to our show. "81% of Americans think the federal government is corrupt. The other 19% probably work for the federal government." So says a new survey from prominent pollster YouGov, who asked 1,100 Americans if corruption is a problem. You probably will not be surprised that members of Congress scored the absolute worst, with 90% of Americans saying they are corrupt, while just 2% of Americans think Congress things are clean. For perspective, 29% of Americans believe in Bigfoot, 16% think the earth is flat, 7% think chocolate comes from brown cows, and 2% think Congress is clean. CEOs didn't score much better. 84% of Americans think they're corrupt, which makes sense since they are the ones who bribed Congress. Journalists scored 79% corrupt. University presidents and public school officials were 75% corrupt. Even doctors took a hit after their COVID catastrophe, with 73% of Americans saying doctors are corrupt, and just 1 in 5 saying doctors are honorable people. Interestingly, the results did not change much by political party. Democrats are slightly more skeptical of Congress and CEOs. Republicans are more skeptical of journalists and public schools. But across the board, Americans are convinced we are ruled by thieves and criminals. It's a pretty shabby showing for our self-styled elite. And thanks to DOGE, we are finding the reason, an establishment that lives off thieving hundreds of billions of dollars to impose their authoritarian technocratic utopia upon the country, while divvying us up like pirates' booty. This all gives context to Donald Trump's efforts to bring down the columns of the temple to crash the system in a hard reboot that removes this criminal elite in favor of the American people, once again seizing our own destiny. Of course, that's up against the thieving and very well-funded criminals themselves, who use everything from public schools and captured universities to media, Hollywood, and the lobbyist-fueled lawfare industrial complex to gaslight voters, dissipating their anger into what you gonna do resignation. So what's next? I suspect these numbers will be broadly similar across the world in Europe or Canada, certainly in Latin America. Even worse in places like Japan or Korea, where public support of government regularly scores in the 20s. A few years ago, there was a fascinating study by Princeton researchers that found how much voters like a policy has literally zero correlation to whether it becomes law. In other words, democracy demonstrably is not working. Our laws are captured by special interests. is partly why I'm optimistic about populism. The same corrupt machine that tries to stamp us out is the very reason we are winning. Last week I mentioned how Congress is trying to respend the DOGE savings to the point DOGE may not succeed in cutting anything. It might just repurpose money from transgender operas to border walls. But even if that happens, the most long-lasting legacy of DOGE is the industrial-scale corruption is exposed in America and around the world. When 2% of voters think the system is clean, we have a systems-level failure. DOGE gave us a path to fix it that is gradually breaking through the media shield. On the other side, we get a democracy that voters can actually believe in again. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersanons.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.